and good noble friends of all stripes. I am Antonio de Sforza, and welcome to Dukes, Duchesses, Knights and Barons, and What on Earth is a Marquess? An introspective on the ranks, titles, and styles, which are all three different things we'll look at, for the Society of Creative Anachronism and how they interact with the noble systems of medieval and Renaissance Europe. I know that's a mouthful, and we're going to jump into it all, and we're going to take it and we're going to tackle it bite by bite. First off, we're going to do this mission statement, which from the moment of its inception, the SCA has strived to authentically recreate the arts, the sciences, the combat, and the courtesy of the various times all long gone by. In this pursuit, a vast array of pageantry has emerged across the known world, with a sea of royals and nobles and pointy hats presiding over it all. But have you ever stopped to think why a knight would stand before one baron and behind another in the order of the march? Or why somebody who is a master artisan holds a higher station in the society than somebody with one of those crowns or coronets on their head? In this class, we're going to explore the social structures of the medieval European and Renaissance world, their counterparts in the SCA, and how the two evolve into the modern systems we have today to honor those bygone times. Class concept, again, is going to be an introspective on the ranking systems and how they interact. And by the end of this, you guys will be able to identify all the major ranks of the European noble structure from period and how those are going to see the parallels where they do and surprisingly where they don't within the SCA. And in my research into this, I have come to one critical thesis, which I'm just going to read because it's the fastest way to do it. As a historical recreation organization whose core mission revolves around presenting history as it should have been, the Society for Creative Anachronism assumes the ranks, titles, and styles of the European world of the Middle Ages and Renaissance and molds them to suit the needs of their game while attempting to remain as truthful as possible to the original contexts. And first, we are going to jump into the history. So that way we have a solid idea of what the SCA is drawing its inspiration from. And the first place to begin with this is going to be an overview of the geography. I know a little bit boring and a little bit out there for what we're here to do. But trust me, this is super important for context. And in the beginning of the medieval era, which is anchored around 500 BC, even though that's not universally considered the year, this is our normal anchor point. And as you can see, we have two major divisions here. In the east, we have the Eastern Roman Empire as it's going to evolve into what is going to be known as the Byzantine Empire. It is more centrally controlled, even though we have all these little divided areas, they are all under one central government. In the west, the ancient Eternal City has fallen to the Ostrogoths and various other Germanic and essentially non-Latin speaking groups, collectively what we would call in period barbarians, which to the Romans was anyone who did not speak either Latin or Greek. But in this period, they have conquered those who do and have now spread out. We have the Franks in the north, we have the Visigoths in the south, and we've got a bunch of different groups in between. And we've got the ancient Britons and a lot of the Celts forming in the Isle of Britain. And then down in the very south, we have the North Africans because they were part of the Roman Empire as well. Yet at this point, they are starting to evolve away from a central unified culture with the rest of Europe. Jumping ahead 500 years, we are going to be looking into what is normally considered the High Middle Ages. And now we're seeing the Byzantine Empire is still a thing, but it's starting to be a lot smaller and a lot less centralized than it was before. In the middle, we have what is called the Kingdom of Germany and the Kingdom of Italy. They bleed together without a defined border because even though, for practical purposes, they are not a united country, they do share a ceremonial figurehead known as the Holy Roman Emperor. And that particular figure is going to be majorly important later on once we get into the ranks. And throughout the rest of the map, we see a lot of the different medieval states. We see England taking its medieval shape. We see Ireland taking its shapes. We see the Scandinavian countries of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark taking their forms. We see Poland and Hungary and Bulgaria taking their forms and taking a lot of their golden ages. And then we see the Kievan Rus, who are the predecessors to modern Russia, and they are starting to take their cultural roots. And then in the Iberian Peninsula, we see the Emirate of Cordoba, which is a interesting departure because they, unlike the rest of Europe, is coming from a more Islamic culture and a more Islamic focused context, whereas the rest of Europe is coming from a more Christianized context. And so this area is knee-deep in what's called the Reconquista, where these various groups up here are going to be fighting this particular group down here. It's going to last on and off for a couple hundred years, and it's going to really determine the trajectory of that particular piece of land and the geopolitics of the rulers who hold it. And that is a mouthful. Jumping to the end of what we would consider the medieval era proper and into the Renaissance, we see the Byzantine Empire, the last vestige of Rome, has fallen to the Ottoman Empire. Then we see the Sultanate of Egypt, and we see the various kingdoms and microstates of North Africa. They have all emerged as their own independent cultures, completely detached from European influence and completely within the realm of Islamic influence. And while that has happened in depth in centuries prior to this is when we see a lot of these states break off into doing what they do. In the middle, what was once a complete solid color for Germany and Italy has fractured up. And in a lot of ways, this fracturing really did exist back in the year 1000 and even before. We're going to get into that because that plays a lot into the ranking structures. But beyond that, we're starting to see a lot of the modern nations of Europe taking their shapes, whether it be Spain under the United Catholic Monarchy, to Portugal, to the Kingdom of France, taking its more modern shapes after the 100 Years' War. We are seeing England maintaining its strength over Wales. We are seeing Scotland really holding its own against England for as long as it's going to, because in about 100 years from this, they fall, or they unite with England, not necessarily fall, but culturally a lot of people think they do. And then we see Ireland fractured as it is, and with only the small sliver that my mouse is pointing at under English control directly, yet the English claim the lordship of all of Ireland at this point, and within a few decades, they will claim it as an independent kingdom of theirs in personal union. But I digress. We then, in Eastern Europe, see Lithuania, Poland, and Hungary evolve into the Renaissance forms, and we see the Kievan Rus evolve into the Grand Principality of Moscow, along with various other states dotting Eastern Europe. And with these three maps, we will have the general framework for the ranking structure. But there are two other critical facts that we need to discuss before we can really explain the ranks in detail. The first, and together they make up the societal structure in our history. The first of these major concepts is feudalism, which can be simply defined as a system in the European medieval societies from about the 10th to the 13th centuries, where a social hierarchy was established based on local administrative control and the distribution of land into units called fiefs. Essentially, what you would have is one massive landowner who was the monarch. They were all powerful, but they could not govern all of their land by themselves. So what they would do is they would parcel pieces of it out to their most trusted attendants and warriors. These would be the upper nobility. They would still have massive tracts of land, would be rich and powerful, but could not govern at all. So they would parcel that out further, keeping a piece for themselves as always, and giving the rest of it to the knights. And these people would be the true military might of any feudal state, and they would be what would be considered the lords of the manor, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And they would parcel it out to the peasants and the serfs. The difference between those two words is peasants meant you were free to essentially travel throughout the kingdom and live your life as you saw fit. Whereas a serf, you were not a slave, but you were not free in the sense that you were legally bound to the land where you lived. And you were a part of the package in any of these land units, or any of these fiefs. You were part of that package. But as we in the society generally consider ourselves to be of the upper classes, we're going to be focusing more on those today. And before I can really jump into it, there's one other critical concept that provides immense amount of context, and that is the great chain of being. And my apologies that we're going to have to delve a little bit into religion here, but it is really unavoidable to get the full context. And that is, in the European medieval mindset, there was a very, very strong reliance on hierarchy and the notion that everyone and everything had its place. The metaphor that was used was a great chain linking the Judeo-Christian God at the top, down through the angels, through the monarchs of mortal humanity, through their nobility, to the common folk, to the lower classes, to the animals, and ultimately the rocks and the dirt. And depending on what sources you look at, these would either be united between the lay world and the clerical world, yet in the sources that I've particularly studied, we keep these separate, particularly in the Catholic context, as opposed to the Protestant context where they are normally merged. So we see two chains, one linking God and the angels to the kings, to the princes, to the knights, etc., all the way down, and the other one's connecting that God and the angels to the Pope, to all of the clerics down from them, to the parishioners down, and again to the animals, birds, worms, plants, rocks, and dirt. And this particular graphic I picked up during my time as a performer with the Arizona Renaissance Festival, where we had to memorize this and understand where every person in the cast fit in order to give them the proper reverences as and differentiations and whatnots per station. And now that we have those particular pieces of context underway, we can now go into the ranks. I'm not going to read this entire thing to you because that is just crazy and long and too wordy. But this is a graphic that I've pulled that really encapsulates the structure from the bottom up, and we're going to break it down. The first thing we're going to look at is monarchy. And I've divided monarchy here into two major tiers. We have the upper ranks of monarchy and the lower ranks. Beginning at the very, very top, as I mentioned before, are the emperor and empress. These are the highest ranking monarchs and the highest ranking members of any aristocracy in Europe, period. These were the successors to Rome, whether you believe in the Byzantine tradition or the Holy Roman Empire tradition. Below them, you would have the High King and the High Queen. These were, in a similar sense to an emperor and empress, were seen as above a king and a queen or any of the lower ranks of monarchy, and would typically have lesser kings answering to them. This we see a lot more in early period, as opposed to the Holy Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire, where we see them a little bit in early period, but we really see them in middle period for the High Middle Ages, as well as the later part of the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance.
I was going to say Ireland used that system often.
Indeed. And that was the other main thing that I was going to mention, because High King and High Queen were more of a combined British and Irish thing, more so than a thing that we saw on the continent. Whether it would be High King of Britain, as was known for the likes of Uther Pendragon, King Lear, King Arthur, etc., where it was seen as more of a cultural, mythical rank, but something that the people of the time believed to be part of their history, to the High Kings of Scotland, to the High Kings of Ireland. It was a thing that those cultures saw as their peak. However, when comparing them to the realm of the continent, the imperial ranks of emperor and empress are seen as of higher status, yet both will have subordinate monarchs. Below them, we have our standard flavor king and queen. These are the people who rule a geopolitical state, normally surrounding one major cultural group. Below them, we have what I consider the lower ranks of monarchy. And these, in Europe, in the medieval and Renaissance periods, primarily fit within the context of the Holy Roman Empire. So all four of these were normally seen as vassals of the emperor and the empress. However, they are considered monarchy as opposed to nobility because they were seen as rulers of independent states within the greater confederation that was the empire. The empire was never seen as one solid geopolitical state, but more like what we would see the modern European Union, a conglomeration of states that elects a centralized government to do centralized government type things while the individual states retain their independent sovereignty. In addition, the members of each of these four ranks and all of their families were universally seen as free to marry anyone holding the titles of the upper ranks of monarchy. So they were seen as free to intermarry, where the lower ranks of nobility were never allowed to do so without special permissions. And so they would be considered monarchs in their own right. And in increasing order, we have the sovereign dukes, the sovereign princes, the electors, and the grand dukes and the grand duchesses. Electors, unlike the other titles, are essentially the handful of princes and dukes who have the ability to essentially put a vote in for the emperor. Because unlike kings, queens, and all the lower ranks, in Europe, the Holy Roman Emperor was an elected office. Yes, it normally carried on for a couple of generations per family that held it. When it got to the end of period, it was the Habsburgs all the way for a good long while during and after period, but it was technically elected the whole way through. And so the electors was a level that allowed you to cast a vote. Next, we look at the nobility proper, which has 6 ranks here, which I include princes and princesses. However, this is more nebulous, as we'll discuss before. The primary ranks that we're going to be looking at as noble proper as opposed to royalty are your baron and baroness, your viscount and viscountess, your count and countess, your marquis and your marchioness, and your duke and duchess. Some states have prince and princess as nobles who are unrelated to monarchy, but that is not normally the case. And these are a collection of what we would call the untitled nobility. These are essentially people who make up the noble caste, yet do not have a title in their own right. And these would be either a jonqueur or an elder or a younger in the high countries, to a patrician in the various city-state republics, to the lairds of Scotland, to the ritters and the elderfree of the Holy Roman Empire. And below we have the ministralis, which are an interesting mix of noble and serf at the same time. Essentially, they did not hold the status of a free man. However, they were seen as nobility. And this is a particularly interesting particular interesting case because in all other cases throughout Europe, the noble caste was seen as freemen. They had the ability to move about. They had the ability to conduct their own affairs without being seen as owned by another, where the ministralis did not have that particular recognition. Next, we're going to be looking at the lowest tier of the aristocracy, which is the gentry and the non-noble landowners. These people were not considered members of the noble class. However, they were considered in many cases to be either descended from the nobility or the bastion from which the nobility could be raised up from. The latter being the central mechanic of the SCA, because by the mechanics of our game, by Corpora, we all start as this nebulous untitled nobility and untitled aristocrat with the ability to ascend higher based on our own merits in the game. So we are in some nebulous place between the non-noble gentry and the untitled nobility. And the reason I say we're in a nebulous place is because the real structure of whether you're gentry or whether you're untitled nobility really varies from culture to culture. The gentry is much more of a British thing, where all four of these ranks were seen in the 15th century and the 16th century as the sub-noble gentry based on how the English system worked. However, it was a system that saw its parallels throughout Europe. And from bottom to top, we would have gentlemen and gentlewomen, esquire, which were the knights apprentices that emerged into their own rank, knight and dame, which was the original rank of the gentry back in the heat of the medieval era, where knights were seen as the primary warriors right below the nobility. They were the ones who started the gentry as a social class and from whom the social class grew. Then you had baronet and baronetess. These were, while they sound like the noble titles of baron and baroness, were not. They allowed you to carry the style of sir or dame, just like a knight or a dame would. However, unlike a knight or a dame, they allowed you to pass it down. The flip side, though, while a knight and dame is normally something that is earned for great achievement and for military service and period, a baronet or a baronetess is essentially a way for the English and later British monarchs to make money off of their upper classes by allowing those of lower rank to buy title and status. It was a way for a lot of these monarchs to fund their wars and make a little cash on the side without raising taxes, which they typically needed Parliament's approval to do. So this was their way around it. And then below we have these two titles, which Lord of the Manor and Seigneur, being the English and the French names for this particular thing, are essentially the name of the person who is in charge of one of these fiefs. Lord of the Manor means you own a fief. Being a Seigneur means you own a French fief. And it could be someone who is a knight, it could be a duke, it could be anything between or beyond. This just means that you hold the parcel of land. Now that we have all of that context out of the way, let's go quickly into a look for the social structure of the SCA. At a glance, this is everything in a nutshell, from the king and the queen to the princes to the counts and the dukes, even though those should be flipped. Then below them, we have the territorial and court baronies. And then below them, we have the peerages along with their students. This particular graphic was the very first one that I saw in my time as a Scadian. And at that point, the Masters of Defense did not have a universally recognized name for their students, that they had just been established as an order. And I know that in some kingdoms, they're still trying to decipher what name their students will take. But at this point, and at the point this graphic was made, they didn't have that yet. So we don't have their name for it there. However, that is not as relevant as we need to for this class, so I'm going to jump to it. Next, we're going to look at the Order of Precedence, which is essentially the rulers of the kingdom, their heirs, the rulers of the territorial principalities and their heirs, and then the barons and their heirs. Below them, we have the royal peers, who are those who have ruled before, the members of the four bestowed peerage orders, the members of the grant level orders, those with a simple grant of arms, those with court baronies, and the Americus orders, and the simple award of arms. And this is the basic mechanic of how you gain precedence. Say you're somebody with an Americus order who then gets a grant order. Essentially what happens is you become the lowest ranking person with a grant level order and nothing higher, and everyone behind that level would take one space back. And then here is a comparison of all the titles, and this is the meat of this course. And we go from the top and go down to the bottom. First off, we have king and queen. In history, these would be defined, as I've said before, as the supreme leader who were sovereign over a nation or territory of higher rank than any secular ruler except an emperor or high king where applicable, to whom a king may be subject. They would rule a kingdom or an equivalent-sized territory, depending on the nomenclature of their particular area. In the society, these typically form a pair, although there have been cases where there was only one at a time, who form the crown of any given kingdom and serve as the official rulers. And in Organized Handbook, this is one of the other official names for corpora, because the handbook is a collection of corpora and the bylaws. So this is pulled right from the official mechanics of the game. And in that corpora, the kings and the queens are the ceremonial leaders who serve as the royalty. They serve as the chief examples of courtesy, chivalry, and all of the virtues that we in the society hold dear and want to elevate up. These are the ones who recognize the faithful work of their subjects in all pursuits and elevate them to different levels of prestige as is seen fit. And they're the ones for interpreting the law and maintaining impartial justice for all in the realm. Below them, we have princes and princesses. In history, this title has three main applications. First, the ruler of an independent principality, which would be one of the microstates that we would see within the Holy Roman Empire. Second, members of royal families, which is the most common variety of it when thinking in the general scheme of things, at least in our modern minds. And third, and the least used, is high-ranking non-royal members of the nobility found in certain regions of Europe. In the society, we see two main contexts for princes and princesses. The first are crown princes and princesses, who are the heirs to the kingdom from the moment the champion of a crown tournament is determined to the point that they crown themselves as the sovereign. And at that point, they and their consort are known as the crown prince and the crown princess, or crown princes or crown princesses, depending on gender identity, because we have inspirational equality, which is awesome. And yeah, that is that one. The second,
I have a quick question, if we can ask them.
Sure thing.
You mentioned that the prince and princess crown themselves. Is that true across the board, or is that just in Atenveldt?
That is a tradition that actually varies. In Atenveldt, we take pride in the fact that our crown princes and princesses crown themselves. In other kingdoms, it is a thing that varies. Some require the monarch to, the outgoing monarch to crown the incoming one. Others require that the monarch crown themselves. It really varies from kingdom to kingdom. But here in Atenveldt, you are correct in that we have our monarchs crown themselves. But
Antonio?
Yes?
I can hardly make out your voice. Fina came on, and her voice was nice and loud, and I could hear her real good.
Mr. Charles just called me a loudmouth.
No, I didn't mean it that way.
I know.
I just mean that it convinced me the problem's not on my end.
Well, my apologies, sir. I'm very soft-spoken, so I'll try to project a little bit more. Is this a little bit better?
Yes, a little bit better.
Thank you. All right, then. And jumping back where we left off, the next major context for the prince and the princess are the rulers of the territorial of the territorial principalities. Like their kingdom level counterparts, they are the people who govern a major region of the society and are those who embody all the major ideals that we in society hope to embody. They are the ceremonial leaders of their principalities. They are in charge of granting rewards within their principalities and recognizing the populace and serving as that ceremonial head in the same way as the monarchs do. Next, we jump to Duke and Duchess. And in history, this set of titles is pretty much identical to princes and princesses in that they were either the rulers of an independent state, typically within the Holy Roman Empire. They were the dynasts of a royal family, whether the immediate children of a monarch, the grandchildren, the brothers, siblings, uncles, what have you. Or they were typically the highest rank of nobility that was completely outside the context of a royal family. So all three contexts, just depending on the prominence of use. Although for the majority of the medieval period, dukes and duchesses were far more common in all of their varieties than princes and princesses ever were. However, in the society, because princes and princesses are more ingrained in the popular imagination, we put those on a higher pedestal and give them a higher prominence. In the society, however, we define dukes and duchesses as people who have reigned over a kingdom 2 or more times, and this title is assumed automatically at the end of a second complete reign. The moment a monarch takes that crown off their head for the second time and ends their reign, they get this title. Whether or not it is ever recognized, whether or not there's ever a ceremony, they are free to be a duke or duchess, and they hold that place in precedence forever. And as such, they are entitled to wear a coronet of precious metals adorned with strawberry leaves. Now, in the society, this particular title has an interesting history in that the male form of this was established in AS2, whereas the female version of this title was established in AS7. Originally, the concept of royal peers stemmed with the dukes, and it was back in the days when we had gender-specific roles for who could be fighters and who could be consorts. And we had seen a couple of members in the Western Kingdom rule multiple times. And at that point, they wanted to continue fighting. All the tournaments, however, were crown tournaments because they were all to win a crown for your consort. But a lot of these men didn't want to sit out for the next one in order to have a go this time. So what they did was invent this title of Duke in order to say, hey, I'm a badass. I know this. I'm epic. I'm awesome. I don't want to rule because I've done it multiple times. So let's give it to someone else, but I'm still here because fighting is awesome. And the society went with it and granted them this particular status of Duke and made it happen. 5 years later, we saw duchesses arise as multiple women at this point started to reign more than once. And at that point, we established the Counts and Countesses as those who had reigned one time so that any person who descended from the throne would have a permanent mark of their service. But before we cover the Counts and Countesses, we're going to cover the title in history that exists between the two levels, which is the Marquises and the Marchionesses. In history, this was a title of nobility that ranked between the dukes and above the counts or earls. They are often associated with the borders, the frontiers, and those politically vital regions of a country that require a greater degree of trust from the monarch than an earl or a count would be given. However, this rank throughout Europe was known to not be used all that much. This is post-period, but we even see this in the journals of Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom, where her prime minister told her flat out, people were made marquises when it was not wished that they would be made dukes, because it was often seen as a step below a grander title. And that sentiment was carried throughout the rest of Europe for centuries before then. In England, we have an interesting quirk where marquises and marquesses denote their British title holders with one spelling, with the title holders in foreign lands having a different spelling when their titles are translated into English, as seen here. Essentially, the French variation of these titles were used for anyone whose title did not come from the English monarch or later British monarch. In the society, however, this title does not exist in any context at all. In other games that do a similar thing to what we do here, it does in various contexts, but in the SCA, no marquises, no marquesses, nada. Why? I do not know, and that is something that I am looking to do further research into. Next, we have the Counts and Countesses, and this is really where we get into the meat of nobility rather than royalty. This was a title of nobility equivalent to the British Earl that ranked between the marquises and the viscounties or baronies where viscounties didn't exist. These were the governing nobles over a shire or a county or a province. In very, very rare cases within the Holy Roman Empire, there were certain counts and countesses who were considered sovereigns, but this was almost a universally unknown thing, and a count or a countess was almost always a vassal to a higher ruler. In the society, it was a person who had reigned over a kingdom one time. They were established in AS7 along with the Duchesses in both this time, both male and female varieties of the title were invented and presented together. And they are entitled to wear and battle coronets of precious metals. So that crenellated design, this is for them. Next, we go to viscounts and viscountesses. In Europe, this ranked between the counts and the barons below them. And originally, they were not considered nobles at all. They were the deputies of those counts and of those earls. Particularly in the Carolingian period of France and Germany, they were seen as an emerging officer of the higher nobles that eventually evolved into a noble title within their own right later in period. These, again, like marquises and marquesses, were far less prominent than any of the other ranks throughout large portions of Europe. Why this is, we do not know. In the society, these are the people who have reigned over a principality any number of times. Unlike the kingdom level where you have the county and the duchy, the viscounty is it for principalities. You could reign once, you could reign 100 times, and you would still be a viscount or a viscountess. And like the counties and the duchies, the second your reign comes to an end, this title is yours, and no one can take that away without a major reason to do so, and no one can deny you it for the service you've done. And unlike any of the other ranks of the noble peerages or any of the ranks of nobility that have a coronet in the society, the viscounts and the viscountesses are the ones who have the least standardized design. In some kingdoms, such as Atenveldt, it is a single point in front. In some, it is multiple rows and rolls of spheroids, far outnumbering those of a baron, to the point that it would be clear by visual. And in other kingdoms, it's any design that doesn't look like a county or a viscount, or a county or a duchy. And in some, particularly the mid-realm, and I believe the Meridiers, they have the silver embattled crowns, so they have the crenellations like the counts, but specifically in a color that looks silver rather than gold. Why they do this? Cultural variation. And finally, within the scope of the nobility proper, we have barons and baronesses. In history, these ranked below a viscount and were seen as the base level of noble. And often this rank was oftentimes the terms baron and baronage were often used to refer to all of the ranks of nobility, because all ranks, whether you were a viscount, a marquis, an earl, or a duke, you were also seen as a member of the collective baronage, because every person who held the direct fief of the monarch was considered a baron in the wider sense, whereas those who were just barons were at the lowest end, but all higher ranks were, in the wider sense, considered barons as well. In the society, we have two major forms of barony today: the landed or territorial, who are the ceremonial heads of a barony, and essentially these, like the territorial principalities and the kingdom crowns, are the ones who embody all the ideals of the society to the populace, these being at the most localized level to do it. Next, we have the court baronies, which is an emeritus title that's awarded at the discretion of the crown. It is often a title for retired barons and baronesses of the territorial variety, although not always. It can also be given for outstanding service in a way that doesn't fit the traditional award structure of the kingdom. And while the word court is officially part of the title, it is often left off when referring to someone. So although court baron Jack would be correct, it would often just be said as Baron Jack. And these particular gentles are entitled to wear coronets with designs that vary by tradition from kingdom to kingdom. Primarily, and especially in recent years, it is often solidified across the known world to feature 6 spheroids called pearls, although in some baronies throughout the known world, you will still see a prominent central point right here that has some design motif that is indicative of the barony in question. Although that is much more for territorial baronies than court ones. Although where court ones are allowed that design, it is normally their arms. And fun fact, this is the one level of nobility that is recognized as emeritus across the known world by Corpora. Because while territorial baronies and court baronies may be given either an award of arms or a grant of arms, by Corpora, they must come with at least an award of arms if the recipient of the barony in question does not have one already. Whereas your viscounties, your counties, and your duchies, depending on the status of the kingdom, may grant you a patent of arms. However, that is not a universal, because some kingdoms auto-grant it, some elect to grant it by poll, and others grant it not at all. And then, because this is 50th year, there is a third variety of baronage that existed within the society. And this is what we call the Crown Barony. And essentially, these are the most senior viscounts and viscountesses of the known world, as they are those who ruled the Principality of Atenveldt before it became a kingdom. And while by Corpora definition, they are viscounts and viscountesses, they hold an additional title of Crown Baron and Baroness that puts them ahead in precedence of all other viscounts and viscountesses to come after, and allows them to design their coronets and bejewel them as they see fit, as so long as it doesn't conflict with the counties or the duchies. And next we have Lord and Lady. And this is where we get into the difference between a title and a style. In history, a lord and a lady are the people of the higher social classes who have power and control over others. And in a way, a style is essentially the thing you put in front of a person's name, whereas a title is their rank within the noble system or what position of power they hold. So, for example, within the British system, anyone who was a marquis to baron would be considered a lord or a lady, where dukes were always considered Your Grace the Duke or Duchess of X. If you were to address somebody as Lord something something shire, they would be considered the either Baron, Viscount, Earl, or Marquis of whatever that shire was. In very rare cases, we see this as a rank in and of itself, but often as a secondary one for a higher monarch. For example, the Lord of Man, which is the English monarch, and Lord of Biscay, which is the Spanish monarch. In the society, this is the basic titles for those who hold arms by either award or by grant. It is often bestowed as the first honorific a person receives via their AOA or the equivalent through an Americus order, although in Atenveldt we do not have any true Americus orders besides the Court Barony, and even that, we typically grant that at the grant level as opposed to the AOA level. And depending on kingdom traditions, they may or may not have special regalia. Next, we're going to jump down real quick into knights and dames. In history, these were the warrior elites of the medieval world. Men with this title were honored as Sir so-and-so before their given name. Women were given the title of Dame before their given name, although the female version of this title really evolved later into period and into the more modern side of things, yet comes part and parcel with the knighthood of old, which is why we include it here. In the society, these are the members of the Order of Knighthood, which is a subsection of the Order of the Chivalry, who have chosen to swear fealty. And as such, they are a member of the Patent Order, and by that hold a patent of arms. They bear a white belt, an unadorned chain, known as a chain of fealty, in symbolizing the bond that they make with their crown, as well as spurs. And then the title of Dame is interesting in that within the society, it officially belongs to the Order of Knighthood within the Order of the Chivalry. However, the women in this order do not use it. They were collectively polled a while back and said, you know what, across the board, they prefer to use the style of Sir as opposed to Dame, to the point that Dame has been officially released for use by members of the other peerage orders. And now we come to Master and Mistress. In history, this is where we're going to see the sharpest divide between history and society, because Master and Mistress are both honorifics. However, they are not honorifics that imply rank. These are anyone from a gentleman with no higher style, a gentleman or gentlewoman with no higher style or title, to the lowest beggar when they needed to be addressed formally in a court of law, and anything in between. Whereas in society, these are the members of the Pelican, the Laurel, the Mastery of Arms, and the Mastery of Defense. They are the society-wide peers who all hold a patent of arms and are equivalent to knights. And they are the people who we look up to as the embodiment of excellence in their pursuit while holding the universal peer-like qualities. And each to their own has the regalia of their respective orders. However, there is a case where Master and Mistress is not used in this particular way, and that is in place of the word minister in regards to a job. As such, a master or a mistress of X may be used if somebody wants a gender-specific form of minister of X. However, they cannot say master, mistress, so-and-so of X thing. It has to be Lord, Later, whatever style that they have, so-and-so master/mistress of X. So you are a Jack, master of the revels, rather than master Jack of the revels, to make sure that you know that it is of a job rather than of a peerage. And since we've been talking about peerage so much, let's do a little bit of a deep dive into that. And for peerages in history, there are two main forms of it. The first of the two comes from the Kingdom of France, where the term peer stems from the French word of pierre, which in turn stems from the Latin word par, which means equal. And the French peerage system stems from the traditions of the 12 paladins of Charlemagne and are considered the highest ranking nobles in France, save for the royal family. Traditionally, each of these 12 people bore a specific role in the coronation of French kings and are split up by rank, and religious status. The highest were the bishop dukes, with the Archbishop Duke of Reims being the highest peer of the Kingdom of France. They crowned the French monarch in their cathedral, and they were the ones who officially made somebody King of France. Next, you had the bishop counts, who by virtue of being ecclesiastic rather than secular, outranked the secular dukes and counts. Then you had the dukes, Duke of Normandy, Aquitaine, and Guyenne, are ones that you would recognize as subsets of the English monarch's title. And once that started to happen, and once the monarchies of England and France became completely separated from each other and started fighting to the death, those titles fell out and were replaced with others. Then you would see some of these county titles shifting over to duke and other counties being added in. And then once you get into the late period, say late 1400s, early 1500s, they just start cranking out peerages left, right, and center, nowhere near tied to these original 12, but as an added oomph to a title of rank or of nobility from the other ranks that we've seen before. In England, however, the notion of peerage simply means all people who hold a title of nobility proper. So anyone who has a baron, baroness, viscount, viscountess, earl, countess, marquis or marqueeness, or duke or duchess, any of these people who hold the title in their own right, as opposed to a courtesy title or a spousal title, would be a peer. And as such, we're free to sit in the House of Peers, known today as the House of Lords, and advise the king in matters of state whenever the king commanded their presence. And finally, we're going to touch on the peerage of the SCA, which collectively is the members of the populace who hold a patent of arms, and any person who holds a patent is a peer. And these generally come in one of two ways, whether through one of the 4 patent orders, which are the Lifetime Achievement Awards for armored combat, fencing, the arts and sciences, and service, as well as the royal peers in those situations where they are granted, Duke and Duchess, Count and Countess, Viscount and Viscountess. In all situations, a member of a patent order, aka a bestowed peerage, will always, throughout the known world, hold a patent of arms. Some royal peers, depending on the traditions of their kingdom, may or may not. Some kingdoms like Atenveldt, it is automatic, and that is in our law. In others like the Mid-Realm, it is banned and will never be granted just for serving as a crown. And in places like the East, the incoming crown will vote to see if the outgoing one gets it.
You have 2 minutes.
Thank you. And ideally, all peers, regardless if they're royal or patent or through patent orders, exhibit the peer-like qualities, which are those highest ideals that are embodied by the crowns, the coronets, and the Baroneses. These are the people who embody those qualities and bear excellence in a very specific thing, and are essentially those who we in the society look up to. And here is just a few of the links for my works cited, a little bit of the definitions I use for the various ranks within the PowerPoint, and that is it. Do we have any questions?